This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking about the writer Elmer Kelton. We'll be talking about his life and his literary career with his son and two experts on his life and career, and that'll be in just a moment. And we're ready to talk about the life, times, and writings of Elmer Kelton. And I have three guests on the show. Going from left to right, they are Joyce Roach and Judy Alter, who are experts on the writings of Elmer Kelton. And on the far right, I have Steve Kelton, Elmer Kelton's son. So let me start off with Steve, and let's talk a little bit about who your father was. I know I had read his memoir first, Sandhills Boy, and I know he had served in World War II, and he had married, I guess, your mother, who was a German war bride, and she had her own son. So why don't you tell a little bit about the background of your father before we get into his writing, who he was and where he came from?
Fine. Dad grew up in on a ranch outside Crane, Texas, which is pretty far to the west, and that's the life he knew. He knew cowboys, some old timers who were almost old enough to have gone up the trails. Uh, he did go to World War II. He was young, so he was late into the war. His specialty became obsolete before he went overseas, so he was retrained, and as a result, he missed the Battle of the Bulge, which I guess was fortunate for all of us. And he met my mother in Austria, and when he shipped back to the States after his hitch was up, he arranged to bring her over. It took a couple of years, but he got it done. And they settled in San Angelo, where Dad had a job with the San Angelo Standard Times as an agricultural reporter. And he maintained his journalism career until his retirement in 1990. He was with the Standard Times, and then he was with Ranch Magazine, Sheep and Goat Raisers Association, and then he joined Livestock Weekly in 1968. As again retiring in 1990, and at that point began to devote full time to his books. But he wrote at night and on weekends, and put out 40 some odd novels, I believe. I lose track, and I forgot to check that
Now,
number, but while he was working. I remember the typewriter going in all hours of the night.
Now, I first found out about your father a few years back when my wife and I had gone to San Angelo on a vacation, and there was a local bookstore that had a whole Elmer Kelton section, and I think there's even a building with a mural of your father painted on the side, but he's sort of a local legend in San Angelo. The San Angelo newspaper that he worked for. Was he a reporter? I think I read that he did general reporting outside of the Livestock Weekly. Didn't he also do like investigative reporting on and things?
Well, there was a little bit of that. His specialty was agriculture, and he ran the agriculture column after a certain period of time. He did a little investigative reporting during the Billy Saul Estes scandals because it was
Yeah.
related to agriculture, and he was one of two reporters who actually were escorted up to a hotel room where Billy Saul was. Nobody else in the country knew where he was, but that's probably as close to investigative reporting, I guess, as he would have done. He did the guest worker uh, program during the 50s, the Rosero program, went into Mexico and described a lot of how that worked and how they were recruited and pretty much that sort of thing. Most of the time, it was simply visiting with farmers and ranchers and getting their perspective on things. He reported throughout the 1950s drought, which was essentially 7 years, depending on where he happened to be standing. And that was what gave him the the baseline to Right at the Time It Never Rained, which by most people's standards is probably the best known of his books.
Now I know when I read the memoir, your father had started out writing for magazines like the penny a word or kind of thing. Did Was that in the late '40s after the war?
That would have been, yes, right after the war. In fact, he had returned to the University of Texas to finish his journalism degree, and I think he sold his first short story during that period of time or shortly after. And when the pulps gradually dwindled, his agent got him a book length project, a novel length project with the Valentine books. And he was scared to death trying to do that. What he did was expand a short story and flesh it out, and that turned out to be the beginning of the whole novel career.
Yeah. Was he now? Did he write? Now I know when I read the Time It Never Rained, for people to call that a western just because it's set in Texas is kind of misleading. I think it has more in common with the novels of John Steinbeck than Zane Grey. But I did read that he originally started out writing classic, Owen Wister, Zane Grey type western novels. Correct?
That's correct. He he was always trying to reach something a little different. Dad has said in a number of times that plotting was not his long suit, that he appreciated characters more.
Hmm.
So he built the stories around the characters, and the plots sort of developed themselves.
Yeah.
But that's what he was trying to do, and his publisher said, well, send me the same thing, but just make it different. And that was the direction he got. But Greg, he began to branch out from the pretty much the action genre and
Yeah.
try to develop characters and let those characters and their traits and situations create the storyline.
Yeah, well, let's turn to Judy Alter then. Judy, since Steve has sort of set the tone with talking about Elmer Kelton, the man, why don't you just introduce yourself and your relation to Kelton, whether you worked with him or were a critic or whatnot, and then talk a little bit about Elmer Kelton's writing.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be with TCU Press, and the former director made an arrangement to reprint, I think it was The Time It Never Rained was first. We eventually reprinted something like close to 20 of Elmer's novels, and they were bestsellers for us. The second highest bestseller on our list ever was The Time It Never Rained. So I enjoyed working with Elmer. I enjoyed getting to know him. I remember all his stories about the transition from genre westerns to the distinctive work that he did. I think, Steve can correct me, the first breakout novel was The Day the Cowboys Quit.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
And he struggled over The Time It Never Rained, rewrote it several times, couldn't get it like he wanted it, but he finally did, and it was great. He was a wonderful storyteller. He told great stories about, like, when he announced to his father he wanted to be a journalist, his father said, "It's the trouble with you kids, nobody wants to work today." So it was a wonderful friendship, working relationship, and I tried to reprint every novel that I could get permission for. His New York publishers held the original contract, but some of them went out of print, and we kept them in print.
Well, when you say that they were bestsellers for you, what did they sell in their original printing in New York? I mean, was he a best-selling Western writer? Could he live off of his writing and just did the work as a journalist in his later years on his side? Or was it one of those things where because it was a genre, it was marginalized and he didn't make as much as, say, I don't know, Jacqueline Suzanne, someone from the 60s or 70s like that?
I don't think he ever reached that point of sales in New York.
Yeah.
But he did for us because he had a built-in regional audience who knew him. And he was great about going around and talking to various groups. We used to laugh about, if you've heard Elmer once, you've heard everything he's going to say, but you're still spellbound and you sit there and listen to him.
Yeah.
Would you agree, Steve, that he didn't get really best-selling status in New York?
That's true. Most of the publishing companies didn't put a lot of effort into publishing westerns. They saw them as the genre thing, regardless what they were. And that was one of the reasons he had to rewrite The Time It Never Rained so many times, because it just wasn't what they wanted.
Yeah, I think I read that he had originally written it, the first draft in like 58 or 59, and it sat around for 7 or 8 years. He did a second draft, and then he sat around for another 4 or 5 years and did a third and final draft.
That's about correct. I can't tell you just exactly, I forget now just when it came out originally, but it
was
would have
72 or 73.
Yeah. The thing we did that I liked was our covers were prettier than the New York covers. We did some beautiful editions of his work.
Yeah,
I would agree. The original Time It Never Rained, they had the character's hat on backwards, for heaven's sake. That was a New York deal.
well,
And then they reprinted it, and most of the cover was saguaro cactus,
yeah.
which does not exist in West Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me bring in the third member of our group here, Joyce Roach. I only have her by audio, but Joyce, if you could tell us a little bit about your knowledge and relationship with Elmer Kelton, and talk a little bit about your opinions on his writing.
Yes, I'd be glad to do that. I've been listening to Steve and Judy, and I've got to go back to Steve talking about his dad. The one thing he did at workshops and that sort of thing, and he did often, our symposiums, he was always in demand really for speakers and that sort of thing. And his advice to young writers was, don't give up your day job.
Yeah.
And I think he was right about that, and that he knew, as he said, he could never have made a living just at writing. Another thing that was always interesting to me about when he talked, and that was that he would say, which amused everybody, he said, most of Western heroes, are 6 feet tall and brave. And he said, my heroes, he said, are 5 feet 8 and nervous. Which always was delightful to hear him say. As Judy said, no matter how many times he would give these programs and say these things in front of large audiences, we never grew tired of listening to Elmer. And I skipped over because I was so interested in listening to Steve and Judy. I didn't say who I was or what my relationship was. I first met Elmer Kelton because of Western Writers of America. Through that organization. Then later on, he was always present at Texas Folklore Society, where he freely admitted that he was a liar and a thief because he stole, as he said, ideas from that organization, from many of those papers that were given at the folklore meeting, which of course I think he felt that all writers, not just himself, but all writers were liars and thieves. Then I became acquainted with him over the years, mainly even through TCU Press, being around him there. And Judy and I both were at meetings where he was. And I don't know how we got to be what I'd say personal friends. We knew we know his wife Ann. We're around her a lot. She even baked us a Linzer tort at Christmas one year, each of us. And we were in his home a time or two. But Elmer, well, I'm probably jumping ahead of what I need to say, but anyway, he wrote an introduction for a book of mine called The Cowgirls, and then later on I wrote the afterword for one of his books called Honor at Daybreak, which was his least favorite book, probably the least selling book, because he got really out of cattle country and into the oil field business, and I wrote about that. And so that's how I'm acquainted with him and have my opinions about him.
Yeah. Now, Joyce and Judy, are you both scholars that work at universities?
I worked at TCU.
Yeah. And Joyce?
Well, and Judy is a scholar. I'm not a scholar, but I'm a writer, and I've written a lot about Elmer.
Well, let me ask both then Judy and Joyce specifically. Let's talk about Elmer Kelton, his place within Western literature from its beginnings. I guess most people would say, I mean, there were the penny, the time novels of the 1800s, but most people think of Western literature classic beginning with Owen Wister's The Virginian in the early 20th century. And so when we talk about serious Western literature, I know before I even started reading him that Kelton had won like 7 or 8 of the top awards in the Western genre, so he's highly regarded as one of probably the top 3 or 4 Western writers of all time. But I think, having just read what's generally considered his best book by most critics that I've read, The Time It Never Rained, that easily transcends the Western genre. So if both of you can give your opinion on Kelton as a figure in Western literature, his import, and then also how you think he goes beyond that in his best works. So Judy or Joyce, either one of you want to go first?
Well, go on, Joyce.
I'm sorry, what?
Go on.
Go on,
All right,
either one of you.
I was waiting on you.
Okay. Go ahead, Joyce.
I think when Elmer wrote really what he called himself powder burners, but they still were in the Owen Wister tradition, except his powder burners always went further. He mixed cultures, he was especially good at talking about the Hispanic blend of what was going on with the regular, quote, cowboy, but he also was good at, the German influence was always there in his novels.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as The Good Old Boys, even in The Time It Never Rained, that are considered, as some of his best work, well, the best work. His comment about that was that he said, I'm always with those, he said, they never sold as well as the, quote, we'll say powder burners. His were powder burners with a difference, but he said they never sold as well, and he said, and I think that was the reason was that I was preaching to the choir. He said I was writing about a specific time, a specific place, and I was the people who read mostly it. That had to do with they lived in that place too. They knew that life too. Judy, take over. I can think of some more, but I'm going to get off of those first novels.
Okay.
Well, the preaching to the choir line may explain why he was never a bestseller in New York. But I think his first genre novel was Hot Iron in the mid-50s. And you look at that, and then you read The Time It Never Rained, and you can see how very much he grew as a writer. Western Writers of America has named him, am I right, Steve, the #1 Western author?
Yes, they did.
Yes, so within the field, he's as good as you can get. The Time It Never Rained was really my first introduction to working with him. And I remember that I wrote some jacket copy that he didn't like because it is a character study, much more than a Western. It's a character study of a rancher who dared to be independent of government help during the bad years and who really never did win. In the very end, he goes from raising cattle to sheep to goats, which for a rancher is a gradual demotion. And in the end, well, I don't want to give it away, but the land and the weather beat him. And I said something about, well, it's really a defeat. And Elmer said, life doesn't wrap up in happy packages. I wanted to show that. And in most of his really strong novels, and I used to be able to name all of them, that's true. He doesn't wrap it up in neat packages.
Now, let me ask all three of you, and then we'll end this segment. Is there any writer, Western or non-Western, that Kelton either was directly influenced by, say, someone like a Max Brand, or maybe Steve might know, did your father read Isaac Asimov's sci-fi books, in his spare time? Was that his, guilty pleasure or something? Steve, I don't know.
I would say that Dad read all of the early Western novelists, uh, and to some degree was influenced by those. Largely, his influence was the cowboys that he knew, and that's why, for one reason, that his books were a little different even from the beginning because they were set and dealt with situations that he knew to be true, that he had actually lived through and whatnot. As far as someone else, Dad read voraciously, and he would. I don't know specifically whether he read Asimov, but I wouldn't be at all surprised.
Judy, do you want to comment?
I don't think you can leave out his high school teacher as an influence. Is it Paul Patterson?
Absolutely.
And strangely enough, Elmer started out drawing rather than writing. But Patterson encouraged him to write until, I can't remember which one of them died first, but all their lives they were very loyal to each other. And there is a contemporary author, Patrick Deering, who's doing pretty well, who gives Elmer credit for everything he's done. And Patrick's second credit goes to Paul Patterson. So and also Elmer tells that first of all, he had weak eyes. Second of all, he wasn't a very good cowboy. And so he read a lot when he was a child. And there was one year that he was ill and had to miss school and stay home. And he really learned to exercise his creativity during that year. So it was a lifelong process for him.
Joyce, do you have any comment?
Well, yes, I agree with, I'm interested in rehearing the things that Judy and Steve have told about about Elmer. I think one thing that no reader has ever understood clearly, unless you live there and been through it, and that's what a harsh, harsh place West Texas is. It's one of those places that when times are good, you don't want to leave it, but when times are bad, which was very often, you can't. And I think he clearly illustrates that in The Time It Never Rained. He illustrates it in other books as well. Even in Sandhill Boys, he talks about the land, and he said it was a place that no one but a mother, like an ugly child that no one but a mother could really love. Colors are brown, not green. About the only abundance there is and that is space. And I still think truly that no one who has not lived there and through the times that Elmer went through there really understands the place he's writing about, because it's too harsh, and there's no way that film or art can really truly depict what an inhospitable land it is. And Elmer captured that. But we weren't interested in hearing about the land and how harsh it was. We were interested in the characters he put on that land and how they survived or didn't. As Judy said, it's not always a happy kind of place. It's not, the endings are not always happy or always pleasant. In fact, they're somewhat a surprise because you keep waiting for a happy ending and it's not always there. But, and especially in The Time It Never Rained. I have other favorite books, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you talk about him knowing the country and the land, TCU Press put together a collection of his nonfiction columns from Rostock Weekly. And that really shows where he got his material and how well he knew the people and the land. It's called Elmer Kelton Country. It's one of the few, not only, but few nonfiction books, I think.
All right. Yeah, we had a little. I had a little bit of whistling there. Let me just ask one final question. Judy, you had helped edit a book called Elmer Kelton Essays and Memories. Was that drawn by Elmer himself, a self-portrait?
No, that was done by Barbara Whitehead from a photograph.
Okay.
Barbara Whitehead is the designer who did almost all of our Elmer Kelton books.
Okay.
The Buffalo Soldier was the only exception because I knew an artist in Fort Worth who was specializing in buffalo soldiers.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of Elmer Kelton's most well-known books, including The Time It Never Rained. And I am back with my guests, Steve Kelton, Judy Alter, and Joyce Roach, talking about the writings of Elmer Kelton. So let me start with Judy, I guess. What would you consider, other than The Time It Never Rained, his maybe top 3 or 4 other novels that, let's say, would establish his place in the canon? And let's just talk a little bit about that, so that people who've never heard of Elmer Kelton, if they wanted to go read his top 4 or 5 books, what would you suggest?
The Good Old Boys, The Day the Cowboys Quit, The Buffalo Soldier. And I want to say something about Buffalo Soldier, because it illustrated something that he always said to us: listen to your characters and they will tell you what's going to happen. He started out to write a book about a buffalo soldier, a freed slave who joined the army and his life was on the rise. But there was a Comanche chief whose life was declining because the Comanches were losing their way of life. And Elmer said no matter how he tried to focus on the buffalo soldier, the Comanche chief kept taking over. So in the end, it's a book about the rise of the buffalo soldier and the decline of the Comanche. And it parallels both perfectly, and it, I forgot where I was going with that, but it illustrates it. The other one was The Good Old Boys, I believe, that he sat at his father's bedside and wrote. And he said, the characters took over now. Steve, you'll have to help me. Like a cold-jawed horse. That they kept telling these stories, and it was almost like he was transcribing, because his characters told him what was going to happen. And mostly from stories that his dad told at his bedside, and stories that he'd heard all his life.
Yeah, Dad said that, and it was a problem for some people. He never had a synopsis ahead of time in a book. He never had it outlined. He said he tried that a few times, but the characters always took it someplace he didn't intend for it to go. So there was no point in having that.
Yeah, I know as a writer myself, this is one of the things I tell to younger writers, that they say they get too welded on what their initial ideas, and I always tell them you have to let it go where it goes. If you want to write a poem or a story about a poodle and it turns out to be the Battle of the Bulge, go with the Battle of the Bulge, and you can always go back and write the poodle story again. So that's something I always tell young people.
We talk about the difference between pantsers and plotters, and Elmer was definitely a pantser. He wrote by the seat of his pants, without a plot in mind.
Yeah.
He probably had a starting point, a story he wanted to tell, but it evolved as he worked on it.
Yeah. How about you, Joyce? What are your opinions on Kelton's sort of canon?
Well, it'll be a little bit different perhaps than the other two. I said I was not a scholar. I'm not a scholar in that I've not devoted my writing or my life to the things that a scholar does, but I was a adjunct professor at TCU, and I taught exclusively, after a while, the Western novel and literature of the Southwest. And of course, in Western novel, I chose to teach The Wolf and the Buffalo because I thought it was a composite of different people and different issues, and the fact that he, as Judy said, and Elmer too, excuse me, Steve, looking at you is a lot like looking at your dad.
Yes.
I can't,
Yeah, but I look older than he did.
Oh, no. But The Wolf and the Buffalo, it wasn't The Buffalo Soldier, Judy, it was The Wolf and the Buffalo was the title of that one. And you had for one thing, it was one of the first times, rare times, that Kelton would take a character and sit him down in a different world, he or she, in a different world, and let you see what happened to them. He did that in Honor at Daybreak, but in The Wolf and the Buffalo, he took someone who knew absolutely nothing about the Western culture, who'd been a slave all his life, Gideon, and his sort of sidekick, as it turned out, Jimbo, who knew everything about horses, but not much else. And he takes those two characters as they become soldiers after the Civil War, and he sits them down in this, they come from this tree forested place in the South and that sort of thing, takes them out and dumps them in many ways, at least for the reader, dumps them in the middle of around Fort Concho and San Angelo and those rough and wild and rugged places, and lets you see what happens to them. So it's a double kind of thing as Gideon realizes, or as Judy said, that his career or his life is on its way up. It's been at the very bottom, and he's about to find out who he really is when he's dumped in that location. And instead of being completely overwhelmed by it, he becomes himself. He realizes the strengths he has, the power he has because of that landscape. Then you have Gray Horse Running, who is the Comanche, and as Judy said, his life is on the way down. His culture's life is on the way down. It's interesting that these two characters actually never meet. Gideon sees Gray Horse Running through the grass one day and scares him to death, because he knows there are Indians there. That, but he doesn't know. Actually, they never meet. And then the other part of that is an interesting intermingling, and that is the life of the cavalry itself. That I don't know that Elmer had ever written about exclusively. But to me, that's one of the most interesting books, and as far as I'm concerned, my opinion, it is the best book. It certainly was the best book to teach because it had college students were terribly taken with that particular book in that they'd never met that combination ever before in literature. And of course, it was Western novel, and so that certainly stuck with that. But I think teaching Elmer's works was one of the things, and I did teach some others, but I think that Elmer's works were a revelation to a college class of students who'd never come across Western literature. After all, their lives had been busy reading what they're supposed to read, and it certainly didn't include Western literature, either in high school or any other time. And that, to me, was one of the great pleasures of teaching Elmer Kelton in whatever I taught. But
Yeah.
The Wolf and the Buffalo, I think, was the very best, for me, anyway.
Well, let me ask you, Joyce, since you said that you taught Elmer Kelton, in modern MFA writing classes, they always the emphasis is always on the self and what one is feeling at any given time. And in having read just the Time It Never Rained, I get the sense that Elmer Kelton was someone who is a keen observer of life and is able to get inside other people, which is sort of antithetical to the way writing classes teach nowadays, especially like the stuff that gets published in New York. And I'm wondering, did any of the students that you taught, and I don't know if you taught writing, any writing classes as well, but did you find that people were more interested in the way Kelton approached writing versus the way writing is now taught nowadays?
No, I didn't notice that because this was their first introduction to Western literature of any kind. They always had to write a paper for me, as part of it, but it was not, it was not a writing. I did not compare writing or what they were to look for, except for theme and characters, the kinds of things they'd need to look for in any sort of literature that they were studying on the college level. But they were so struck by the stories. They were so struck by simply the plot, the characterization. They were certainly struck by that. But as far as the way writing classes are taught and that sort of thing, no, I didn't teach it, from that point of view. As I said, they had to write. And they didn't have any trouble writing. They just wrote and wrote and wrote, which was delightful in a college class. It was not of course, it had writing emphasis, but it was not a writing course per se, and it was not taught the way a good many literature courses are taught, except for the obvious, as I said, plot, theme, characterization, and that sort of thing. I don't know whether I answered your question or not.
No, you did. Judy, how about you? Did you also teach Elmer Kelton in class?
No, I didn't do much teaching. I have done some, but not. But I wanted to pick up on what Joyce said about the wolf and the buffalo. One of the things Elmer always said was that he liked to take a character and put him in a time of change and see how he reacted. And one that we haven't mentioned yet, The Man Who Rode Midnight, does that because it takes an older cowboy whose day has passed, but whose glory rests on the one time he was the only person that rode this outlaw horse. And he sees the world around him changing, and they're going to develop and put in an amusement park or something near where he lives. And he sent his grandson or nephew or something, a city kid, is sent to spend the summer with him. And it's a time of change for both of them and how they react to it. And I think that was an important theme in a lot of Elmer's work.
Okay. Well, let me focus on the novel that I read, "The Time It Never Rained," and as most of you said, most critics probably say that it's his best work. I know Joyce says she disagrees, but it's the book that I read, and I had read in the memoir and essay book that you had edited, Judy. I had read a little bit about it, and then I read the book itself. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, it was more Steinbeck-like than I thought it was going to be, because what always seemed to be the focus when people talk about the book was that the character Charlie Flagg is conservative or whatnot. But I think a lot of the critics have confused the character with the point of view of the novel, because when I read the novel, it seems very clear to me that Charlie Flagg, as one of you, I think Judy had mentioned, all of his problems basically stem from his own stubbornness, whether it's based on his politics or whatnot. I mean, his son, some of the other locals, after he shoots his mouth off to a local reporter, and the government withdraws its funds. It's like Charlie's living 20 or 30 years in the past, and he hasn't caught up with the then modern times of the 1950s. And his refusal to change is what begins his gradual descent. And it seemed to me that a lot of people were confusing Charlie Flagg with the point of view of the novel, or with Elmer Kelton himself. Do you agree with that or not?
No, I don't think I do. I think Charlie Flagg was, as you say, conservative and behind the times, but he had his pride, and he wouldn't take government help with the strings that came attached to it. And compared to him is the character whose name I can't remember, who has taken all this government dole and eventually commits suicide.
Yeah, the big rancher. I forget his name.
Yes. Charlie remains true to Charlie and to what he believes is right. He does adapt, as I said, by going from cattle to sheep to goats. He realizes the change that's coming with the Mexican American community and the family that he has long supported, but eventually can no longer keep on his ranch. So, yeah, he changes, but as I say, he remains true to himself.
And that particular book, too, was written at a very real time, the drought of the 50s, when the government was doing some dreadful things that we know now. For instance, having ranchers kill their cattle, so that, when it could have, as Paul Patterson has been very clear about that. Of course, Paul is gone now, but and talking about those times that Elmer knew as well, where the government, instead of feeding, maybe taking the cattle and slaughtering them to feed the poor, instead they slaughtered cattle, made ranchers slaughter cattle and just bury them in a pit. And that hurts people of that generation, myself included, to this very day, that the government didn't perhaps behave as it should, but also that was another reason you'd have to know that in order to understand Charlie Flagg's stubbornness. And another thing I talked about, the kind of place it is. The place was a stubborn place. The land, they say, is unforgiving, and certainly it was. But neither the people reflected that stubbornness. They just did. I don't think I knew of anybody that was not a stubborn rancher, or maybe farmer too, but certainly stubborn ranchers. It's a characteristic that hurts them to this day. But I think that Charlie represents those that were stubborn to a fault. And yet, in a way, as Judy said, it was always, Elmer places his characters at a time of change, and you get to see how they either do or don't adapt to it. And I don't think anybody in his novels ever adapted much to change. Some did, but in a sense, of course, Charlie did adapt, and he did have to give in to sheep and goats, and my word, what a come down that was. And yet, at the end of things, his stubbornness somehow has brought him through. There's hope at the end of that novel. He's not lost his land. He's not given in to moving away. He has endured it, and in a sense, it's a very hopeful end. Charlie is going to make it, even if that's
His
to be.
life reunited. I mean, they grew closer, which was a part of the whole theme of the novel.
Right.
Well, let me ask, there's a few interesting passages about Charlie and his wife where he's describing her, and I found that it's a very realistic kind of portrayal of marriage. It's not the sort of sappy Hollywood kind of portrayal of marriage. And are there a lot of, in Kelton's other works, are there other portrayals of human interactions that are as interesting? And for Steve specifically, you could start off, Steve, was the relationship of Kelton, Charlie Flagg to his wife, similar to that between your mother and Elmer?
I would say in some respects, uh, Dad would probably tell you he wasn't quite as stubborn as Charlie, but I think he was wrong. He came from stubborn stock on both sides, and then Mom didn't help anything either. Her family in Austria, that village actually had a term that applied specifically to her family, and it was Lippschädel, and the family name was Lipp, Lipp, and the Schädel evidently was German for a hard head, and in that village, the whole family was known that way. So his stubbornness and her stubbornness, and they got along just great.
Okay. Well, let me just let's end this segment here. We're having a little audio difficulty, and when we get back, we'll talk a bit more about the time it never rained. All right, back with Steve Kelton, Judy Alter, and Joyce Roach talking about Elmer Kelton. And Steve, you wanted to make a final comment about the time it never rained in response to Joyce's comment about the book's ending. So, Steve?
Right. Joyce had said that she saw a hopeful ending in it, despite the bitterness of how it came about. And I agree with that, because what the way it ended, Charlie
hold on, Steve. Hold on, Steve. We lost Judy there. Oh, okay.
Oh, there we
No,
go.
there she's back. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Uh, Charlie basically said he was just going to start over.
Yeah.
With what he had, and he said a man can always start over because a man has to. And now you don't know what's going to happen. It's a tough situation. You don't know, but Charlie never gave up.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a hopeful thing about human nature, and particularly a stubborn person.
Yeah, that's I think one of the things that makes Charlie Flagg an interesting protagonist is that No matter how many times life takes a dump on him, he just keeps on going, even if he's just limping along. One of my favorite scenes is the scene where he's out, I think, in a rainstorm, and he twists his ankle or breaks his ankle, and some young Mexican greaseback, as they or greaseback or greaseball, as they call wetback, is what he calls him in the novel, the old derogatory term. Some young kid basically comes and saves his life, otherwise he would have frozen. And anyway, so Joyce, you had wanted to talk a little bit about Elmer Kelton and his writing of women in his work. So if you want to expound, go ahead.
Well, of course, what made me think of that, and that was Charlie Flagg's wife, and as we said, she was a helpmate, but she was good more than just a helpmate in that she participated fully in that life. And I think it caused me to think about women in general. As far as women in general, it's been even mentioned to Elmer by others that his women characters were not modern women in the sense that they took the bit in their teeth, as the saying goes. But his women were not ever particularly the big protagonists. They were women who were helpful and that sort of thing, even though they had different forms of being helpful, different ways of being helpful. But I think about the woman in the Good Old Boys, Spring, which is an interesting character in that she was not the kind of woman that she loved. I've forgotten the hero's name in that one. She loved
Huey Calloway.
Pardon me?
Huey Calloway.
Yeah, Huey Calloway, I'm sorry, yes. She loved Huey Calloway, but she wasn't, of course, Huey wasn't willing to marry her, and she wasn't willing to give in to that. You know, she was a school teacher. Elmer said that a little of his mother was in that character. But she was a little different in that she held out, and you know she wasn't willing to marry him if he wasn't willing, quote, to settle down, and Huey was not willing to settle down. So there's another kind of woman. Then Huey's brother's wife was yet a different kind of woman. She had settled into, to a home life and didn't understand making a homemaker and a wife and a mother, and she fussed at Huey because he wasn't willing to do that, and Spring wasn't willing to do it Huey's way. Another female character, of course, that I think is interesting, and that is in The Wolf and the Buffalo. You've got more than one woman, kind of woman. You have the cavalry wife who was faithful, used to being alone, accepted it, used to having to take care of herself while husband was gone, and you have that view of women, which is a little different than the general one you hear about. You had Gray Horse Running, his wife, I think maybe Willow was her name, who was a typical Plains woman, devoted in the way that a Native American or Indian woman, Comanche woman was. She's yet a little different story than that. You have even Gideon. Was another type of woman, a black woman, who was really sort of a prostitute put out by her mother or grandmother, I think it was. So there's a different portrayal of women that we don't usually see. But Elmer is called a Code of the West kind of man, where women, where men were men and women stayed home. Was an explanation of that. So I think his handling of women is interesting, and Elmer and Steve and Judy may have something else to say about that.
Well, let me ask: were there no female lead characters in any of his books? They were all male then.
All male.
Okay.
I don't recall any of them.
Okay, and I know the one character that stands out to me in The Time It Never Rained is the daughter-in-law. She's sort of the coming of the 1960s, more modern woman. She's always pushing almost bullying Charlie's son into doing this and that to become a rodeo star. But Judy, go ahead. You looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, Elmer actually caught a little criticism for his handling of women. It was often said that he didn't seem to understand them as well as he did his male characters. And what Joyce says about the Code of the West is right. In person, Elmer was always the perfect gentleman to women. He was courteous and courtly and just really admirable. But in some of the minor characters, like the young wife in The Time It Never Rained, he did not develop them as thoroughly as he did some of his others. I can't remember specifically, but Joyce, didn't you do an essay on women in Kelton?
No, no, I didn't, not that I, not that I remember Judy doing that. I wrote, other things, but I don't think I wrote about the women unless I was just talking about a particular character. And I did write about, in the afterward that I wrote for Honor at Daybreak, I did talk about this being a different kind of woman than Elmer had ever dealt with, before. But that's all. No, I've not written about, just.
Well, I think there's an essay in that book, Memoirs and Essays, Memories and Essays, on Kelton's use of women.
There is, you're right, but I can't remember who it was.
Let me take a
And,
look here.
and it was quite critical. In fact, I wanted to leave it out of the book.
Let's see here. Hang on. Converted, got race and ethnicity, the Huey Calloway trilogy, reading and roping, humor in Kelton, Elmer Kelton speaks out, the Westerner. I don't see one on women. Let's see. Race and ethnicity, Elmer Kelton, Joyce Roach, Huey Calloway, reading.
But there's nothing about women in there.
No, I don't recall it, and I don't see it in the.
Well, then I don't know where I saw it, but
Judy, I think perhaps I was at a conference TCU sponsored many years ago there at Fort Worth, and I think that was one of the I remember it from that, though I can't remember too much in the way of detail.
was that the time that he politely tangled with Patricia Nelson Limerick?
It could
Was
be.
the new historian, and she really resented that the history of the West was the history of the conquest by Anglo-males, and she lit into your dad, but he held his own.
I remember that.
And they parted friends, and he sent her away with an autographed copy of, I believe, The Time It Was Never Rained. I mean, The Time It Never Rained.
Yeah, that may be what I'm remembering. It's been so long, I just, the details I couldn't remember.
That Code of the West came out because he was very polite and restrained, more so than she.
Yeah. Well, let me talk a little bit about the first book of Elmer Kelton's that I read a few years back, which was his memoir Sandhill's Boy, and we'll bring this sort of full circle back to how I opened the interview with Steve. In reading through it, is very interesting descriptions of the land, descriptions of the way people interact, the droughts that were gone through. Now, I wanted to just talk a little bit more in depth about your father's World War II role. Was he on the front lines, or was he a medic, or what exactly did your father do, Steve, during World War II?
He was a rocket man. He had been trained originally in the artillery for the anti-aircraft, and just before they were going to ship out, the War Department decided they didn't need any more anti-aircraft people because there wasn't any aircraft left to shoot at. Luftwaffe was pretty much gone. So they decided that they really did need combat riflemen. And Dad had gone into the artillery. They placed him there because he had flat feet. And so then they decided he ought to be an artillery, an infantry soldier, flat feet and all. And he sort of lost his faith in the military judgment at that point. But I think it took another 6 weeks or more, or 2 months, whatever it was, to retrain these artillerymen into small squad tactics where they could actually survive as riflemen. And Dad's job was to carry the mortar rounds, or the rounds for the bazooka. Consequently, he was the rocket man. And you had the guy who carried the tube, and you had the guy who carried the rockets. And Dad was probably the smallest man in his squad, and he got the load of rockets. But at least they were kind enough to give him a small carbine instead of the heavy battle rifle.
Now, how did your father actually meet your mother? She was in Austria, wasn't he?
Right. This was during the occupation post-war, immediately post-war.
Uh-huh.
Dad was in the displaced persons area, and at one point he was stationed in Mom's hometown of Ebensee, Austria, and they met down by the lakeside. There was a big lake there, Glacier Lake, and they met down by the lakeside. She came down to check a train schedule or a schedule for the boat going across the lake, and they struck up a conversation. Neither one of them speaking the other's language, but Dad did better with German than Mom did with English at first. But that's how they met, and he asked her if he could walk her home, and she wasn't too sure about that, but okay. And then one thing led to another. She baked him an apple strudel, and that was the beginning of the end of that deal, because he just couldn't get away from that apple strudel.
Now, your mother already had a child. Was she like a war widow?
Yes, yes, and essentially, and my brother was 6 years old when they came over here in 1947.
Is he still alive then?
Oh yes.
Oh, okay. So then now I believe in the memoir your father had been shipped back to the U.S. and he came back for your mother and your brother a year later, right?
Well, he sent for them.
Yeah. Okay.
If he had the choice, he could have married her then, and before he mustered out, but he would have had to have mustered out in Europe and paid for both of them, all of them to come over. Or he could come back to this country and muster out on Uncle Sam's nickel and then send for my mother and brother. And that's the way he chose to do it. And he paid for their passage. And my grandfather over there, when Dad left, it was common knowledge. I mean, almost none of the GIs who promised to bring their girlfriends over ever did. And he said, well, that's the last you'll see of him. And sure enough, about a year or so later, they were able to make the transition to come over. And my dad and my grandmother and a great aunt met them in New York and drove them all the way back out to West Texas.
I like to imagine that scene of that meeting of mother and grandmother and Ann, and I've forgotten your brother's name.
Again.
I would certainly enjoy trying to think of that, and what a shock on both sides,
Yes.
No
absolutely.
English and no German and all that went on. That's one of my favorite stories about.
Seems to me I heard a story about your mom's first reaction to West Texas and the landscape.
Uh-huh.
Go ahead with that one.
I don't remember it. You tell me.
Well, it was right about the 4th of July. And the 4th of July in West Texas, anyone who's been here around the 4th of July realize how brutal it is. She had a little chance of transition in that long drive from New York. But let's see, she talked about coming in on the ranch on one of the roads there, and it was late at night, and all she could see in the headlights were jackrabbits running back and forth across the road. Every once in a while they'd hit one. And it just, she was used to rabbits at home that were fat, and they raised them and ate them. But she wasn't used to people running over them. So it disturbed her quite a bit. But I remember those things myself, from other years. But when the jackrabbits were thick, they were really thick. And they'd run back and forth across the road, and there wasn't any way on earth to miss them.
Yeah. I remember one time my wife and I were in Big Bend, and we were driving down a road, and there was this lone jackrabbit that came out of nowhere and seemed to have a death wish. He ran straight for the tire. He was behind us, and he outran us and went straight for the tire. And I hit him. I'm like, oh my God! And I'm like, it was a suicidal hare. I mean, it was just crazy.
I've had deer do that, and they did as much damage to my vehicle as I did to them.
Well, let me ask both Judy and Joyce then. We're sitting in the year 2015, and we've mentioned that Elmer Kelton is acknowledged or voted. I guess I don't know if it's voted or how he, but he's acknowledged as the top Western writer by the Western Writers of America. Where do you think in the coming, say, the rest of this century? Where do you think Western writing will go? Where will Kelton's place in Western writing be? And what do you think his continuing legacy will be? Either Joyce or Judy.
I think Jim Lee used to talk about writers who will be still 100 years from now. I think Elmer is one of those. I think his work will last. I'm not really up on what's happening in the Western today, but I think Elmer's legacy is one of transforming the genre so that we got some better literature out of it.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think his reputation will live on.
How about
Joyce?
you, Joyce?
I certainly agree with that. I had occasion to go into Western Writers of America website looking at the meeting that's coming up in June. And I was surprised not to see Elmer's name anymore there. It doesn't have anything to do with his place, you know, historically, but there were other names, particularly Cormac McCarthy. I'm trying to think who else was up there that I recognized, but certainly who write a different kind of Western. And in fact, Western Writers of America had to make a big change itself, and that they were, for a while, not willing, especially I can remember in the short story and even in the novel, well, that's not Western literature, they said. And of course, that was a time when they were beginning to realize that they had to include more than just the traditional Western or the traditional Western short story or traditional anything, and recognize that things were, you know, going in another way. So that tells me, okay, Larry McMurtry was the other one. Larry McMurtry and Cormac McCarthy, and there were some other names, and frankly, I didn't even recognize those two. I did, but so Western writing itself is changing dramatically, and the things that are called Westerns would be not recognized as Westerns in the past when Elmer was at the height of his writing. Certainly, Elmer found out even in his lifetime that the great publishers of Westerns, whole, you know, section that they had, and that was Doubleday, and then Doubleday stopped, and Elmer had to go to another publisher because they weren't interested in any of, quote, the old style writing. But I agree with Judy. Elmer's place is secure for all time, but it's not, as I said, it's not particularly recognized today.
Well, let me ask though. That might be a good thing overall because you know, genres can often be ghettos, and it sometimes takes a couple of generations to get writers or any artist out of a particular ghetto. Because Kelton, at least in The Time It Never Rained, I think as a book, aside from the fact that it's set in Texas, I mean, I think that's as good a book written in the second half of the 20th century, you know, and you can compare him to people like a Kurt Vonnegut or a John Updike or other people of that ilk, or Norman Mailer or whatnot. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Do you?
No, I don't. No, I don't think it's a bad thing. As I said, his place is secure, the way I look at it, and if you know, nothing will change that. Judy, do you agree?
Yes, but I was thinking, as Joyce talked about the changing of the Western, about the time a woman's novel won the Spur Award for the best novel, and one of the male members of the organization was absolutely indignant because that category was for the men's action novel. And
Right, and it's you who won that.
Pardon?
It was you who won that.
Yeah, it was. But that's what Elmer moved beyond. I mean, you know, he was way ahead of his time, getting the genre out of, or getting Western literature out of the men's action category.
Well, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll end the interview and give you each a final say on Elmer Kelton. So we'll do that in just a moment. Well, let's end this interview about Elmer Kelton, and I want to give each of my three guests a final say-so on anything related to Elmer Kelton or the Western novel. So let's start with Joyce. Any final opinions about the Western or Elmer Kelton? Joyce?
Well, I think I probably said most of it in my last comments about Elmer's place in literature, but I think one of the things that has been the most pleasant in thinking about Elmer is that I have been able to write about him, write about his work, not necessarily about him, but I've been able to write about his work, and I think maybe that places me in a pretty good position as far as being able to assess his work and when someone asks you to write about him. Maybe it is because he belongs to me, he belongs to us, he belongs to Texas, but I don't think that ever stopped him from jumping borders, always with his writing. And that is important. He was a good friend, and that meant a whole lot to me, and I'm sure it did to Judy as well. And I think we felt that we knew him personally. We knew all about him, as much as we needed to know, but we were also privileged to be able to write about him. And in my case, it was a privilege to have him write about me. And that is the last thing I can say about Elmer, that I can't say it any better or add any more to it, but he's very, very special to me personally, as well as being able to write about him.
Okay. Judy, any final comments from you?
Well, was very important to me personally too, and I felt it was one of the big privileges of my career to get to work with him and to get to know him. As far as his reputation living on, I think we should mention that a critic whose name, John Tuska, once said that The Time It Never Rained was one of the dozen or so best American novels written in the 20th century. And he didn't say best Western novels, he said best novels. And I think that kind of puts Elmer's career in perspective. And he was very important to TCU Press and very important to Joyce and me. And I was glad to get to know Steve and Ann through that connection.
Steve, if you want to have a final say.
Well, I'd have to say he was pretty important to me too.
I think so.
But I find it odd in a way to talk about that in the past tense because for me, he's still here. He'll always be here. And part of that is that the books are there, but sometimes I just kind of hear him talking to me in a certain way. Just as he talked about his characters driving the story, narrating to, Dad's still here. He'll never be gone.
He died in what, 09?
09.
Yeah, so did my mother. Yeah. One final question for you, Steve. Has there ever been any film adaptations or TV adaptations of Elmer's work? And if so, if not, or anything now, I guess you and the family control his estate. Are you negotiating anything in the possible future?
Well, the Turner Network and produced The Good Old Boys with Tommy Lee Jones. He was Huey Calloway. Also directed it and wrote the screenplay. Sissy Spacek was in that. Just a heck of a good cast, and they did a tremendously good job about it. And Dad helped them with describing the home place as he knew it and all that sort of thing. It was a darn good production, and it's a shame it was always a television novel, but it is available on DVDs. As to something else current, The Day the Cowboys Quit is in pre-production, I think, basically, whatever you'd call that, but Uh, Robert, oh, good heavens, I've completely.
Duvall?
Hmm?
Robert Duvall.
Duval, absolutely. He has that one optioned, and I think AMC is going to do that. It'll be a 2-night miniseries. The Time It Never Rained has been under option for a long time, and a woman who's just worked herself half to death trying to get that done. And of course, you run into things, everybody's gung ho until it comes down to the money in Hollywood. And so that's still hanging fire as far as I know. But Robert Duvall is the current best chance.
Yeah, I was thinking Robert Duvall early in the interview that he'd be something attached to such a project. I was looking at some of the photos and that drawing of Elmer Kelton on the Essays and Memories book. I think the actor Randy Quaid actually has some of the facial features. He could probably play a younger version of your father if they ever did his life story. But I want to thank all three of you, Joyce, Judy, and Steve, for talking about Elmer Kelton. And I think his writing is worthwhile and should be read. And I know in the coming years I'll end up reading some more of his novels. And I have three of his books that I would recommend reading. The first is the Elmer Kelton Essays and Memories, which was co-edited by Judy Alter. The second is Sand Hills Boys, The Winding Trail of a Texas Rider, which is the memoir that Kelton himself wrote. And of course, finally, The Time It Never Rained, which is generally with Joyce's noted exception, by most people considered Kelton's best novel. So if you're interested in good writing, whether it's Western or just good writing in general, I would recommend young people read Elmer Kelton or find him out, whether you're in Texas or whether you're in Montana or whether you're in Argentina. But again, thanks to all three of you. And next week I will be talking a little bit more about some other writing and in another show. So join me then. But again, thank you to Joyce, Judy, and Steve, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.